Evander the real deal Holyfield was an undisputed champion in 2 weight classes. He took part in some of the most iconic bouts of all time, defeating such great fighters as George Foreman, Mike Tyson, and Larry Holmes. Holyfield was able to take on these monsters and move up so far beyond his natural weight class because he possessed incredible technique and intellect in the ring. Holyfield's complexity is often overlooked, so it's far past time to break down his nuanced footwork, rhythm, and punch selection. Holyfield's strong, consistent rhythm was the backbone of his style, keeping him safe and setting up his offense. Whether Holyfield was attacking, countering, or retreating, he always moved to the tick of his own internal clock. Holyfield even kept his beat while infighting, rhythmically bumping shoulders to off-balance his competitors and set up shots. Keeping rhythm while constantly adapting to the movements of an opponent is incredibly difficult. Think of trying to dance to a song while someone's throwing punches at you. But Holyfield rarely missed a beat, using head movement and subtle footwork to stay balanced and in sync with his own preferred movement patterns. With his gliding, bouncing footwork, Holyfield at times seemed more like a throwback to a boxer from the turn of the century, or perhaps a modern-day Taekwondo Olympian. Rather than commit more weight by stepping one foot at a time, Holyfield instead moved both feet together. This way, he could execute more subtle, rapid adjustments that would otherwise have been impossible. Holyfield glided back and forth at the very edge of his opponent's reach, moving right into the line of fire and then right back out again repeatedly. The fact that Holyfield did not have enough respect to keep a safe distance had to be infuriating to his competitors. However, Holyfield's sense of timing was so well developed that he could get away with it. Holyfield's distance perception was so great that he often didn't need to incorporate blocks or head movement into his defense. Instead, he would bounce back at just the right angle to let the punch graze past his cheek, and then return a counter. Holyfield's constant repetitive motion conditioned his opponents to expect rebounds and jolts, dulling their reaction to sudden explosive movements, and lulling them into a false sense of confidence. What all this meant was that Holyfield could sometimes get away with blatant attacks, simply because they blended so smoothly into the rest of his movements. In a weird way, by making his footwork so telegraphic, Holyfield made his attacks non-telegraphic. Holyfield made himself into a very tempting target by constantly skirting the edge of his opponent's range, and this compelled them to overreach just a bit more each time they threw, in the hopes of finally catching him. This was all part of Holyfield's plan, who drew out these overextended punches on purpose, specifically to counter them. Holyfield stayed in range to counter by bouncing slightly offline, rather than straight back. These lateral adjustments were so minute that opponents rarely realized they were off target until their punch had already missed. By then it was too late, and the new angle helped to set up Holyfield's counter. Holyfield's constant motion also meant that he always had momentum to put into his punches. In this way, his phasic footwork allowed him the ability to rebound right back into range. Holyfield didn't always retreat first. Sometimes he moved in to intercept an opponent's attack with his own. Never breaking his rhythm, Holyfield would use the momentum of his footwork to spring in even closer, evading his competitor's shot with head movement and angled footwork. These counters hit much harder, as Holyfield's opponent was essentially adding weight to his punch by moving into it. As talented as he was at setting up simple counters, Holyfield was best known for his ridiculously long exchanges. By constantly changing angles and adjusting distance, Holyfield could keep exchanges going for an unprecedented amount of time. The longer the exchange went, the more Holyfield forced his opponents off angle, and the less accurate they became. Holyfield drowned his opponents in these deep exchanges, refusing to stop even when he took the occasional hit himself. It should be emphasized that Holyfield was not simply unloading his own punches on a beaten, wary competitor. He was actively defending against fresh competition while landing his own attacks. During these long exchanges, Holyfield's footwork became far more pronounced. Rather than bounce, Holyfield would take large steps or pivot to adjust his position while punching. Holyfield tended to step far to the outside in order to place a shot right over his opponent's lead shoulder. This was especially crafty, as opponents are less likely to notice adjustments made with the back foot. Holyfield used this tactic at close range as well, disengaging suddenly and throwing a sneaky punch around his opponent's guard. This was in fact his preferred method for getting off the ropes. Holyfield also knew when to stop punching, a highly underdeveloped skill even amongst high-level competitors. In the same way that jazz musicians can show their mastery by the notes they don't play, Holyfield showed his mastery through the punches he didn't throw. In the beat where most boxers will follow up with another punch, or simply end the exchange, Holyfield could instead use that time to re-establish distance, or set up better shots. Notice here how Holyfield takes the extra time to sidestep twice before throwing each right. Sometimes, he would simply bounce in place until the right shot presented itself. Making adjustments mid-combination under such intense pressure is something few fighters have the skill and calm to pull off. However, none of these tactics would have worked so well if not for Holyfield's exemplary punch selection. Put simply, Holyfield made his combinations far more effective by using one punch to set up the next. For example, he would use 2 high punches to raise an opponent's guard and open up his midsection. Or throw hooks to encourage an opponent to spread their guard and then shoot an uppercut up the middle. Here he throws an uppercut to force an opponent to straighten up, and follows up with a straight. And here Holyfield throws a jab against an opponent who consistently crouches, then uses an in-between beat to adjust his distance and land a hard uppercut. Holyfield of course used footwork to close the distance, so he was always in range to follow up. Holyfield also relied on a high guard, Philly shell, and cross guard throughout his career. These guards became indispensable tools as Holyfield moved up in weight to fight taller, bigger competition. Holyfield already had a tendency to deflect and absorb blows on his high guard by twisting, so the Philly shell worked fairly well for him. He did lack some nuance with his shoulder rolls, relying on cross catches to protect him rather than hunch and pop his shoulder for hooks and overhands. This meant that the occasional shot got through. However, Holyfield more than made up for it with his exceptional cross-guard tactics. While some fighters, like George Foreman, preferred to use the cross-guard as a purely defensive tool, Holyfield was one of the rare fighters who could punch and counter from the cross-guard position itself. The trick to punching with crossed arms is to move the upper body in such a way that it lines up the hands. Put simply, Holyfield incorporated enough head movement to give himself the space to punch. Holyfield was a boxer through and through. His distance, timing, nuanced footwork, and exceptional punch selection should be studied by new boxers as a solid foundational template that can apply to nearly any style. Stay tuned for the conclusion of the 4 Kings of Boxing, and a new heavyweight arc which you may be able to guess from this video. Check out my books on footwork, defense, and power linked below. For the modern martial artist, this has been David Christian, wishing you happy training.